joined the Secretary General in strongly condemning the Taliban's decision to ban Afghan women from working with the UN in Afghanistan. It's a clear violation of our fundamental human rights of women. On a personal note, I am outraged.
Welcome back to About That. I'm Lauren Bird, sitting in for Andrew. Today, we're digging into a major setback to relief organizations in Afghanistan. The United Nations, the biggest and most well-known distributor of aid in the world, is reviewing its operations in the country. The UN has told all of its Afghan staff to not come to work until May at the earliest, potentially threatening many of its critical services in the country. And this is a massive blow to humanitarian aid in that country, and is a direct response to the Taliban barring Afghan women from working for the UN last week.
As the United Nations says, what is happening in Afghanistan is a grave crisis for women's rights and a wake-up call for the international community. It's raised the alarm about the Taliban's orders banning women from aid groups and girls from higher education.
We're still looking into how this development would affect our operations in the country.
This all puts the UN in a tough spot. The UN has categorically said that banning Afghan women from working in their organization violates their own values and potentially international law. But with the largest footprint of any NGO in the country not operating could have devastating consequences. And it's warned that any fallout from a lack of support for Afghan people as a result of this should be blamed on the Taliban. Afghanistan is experiencing one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. UNICEF says more than half of the 24.4 million people there need humanitarian assistance. And the UN says 6 million Afghans are at risk of famine.
The lives of thousands and thousands of people are at stake. It is not possible to reach women without women, and without women they will not be reached. And that's the unfortunate reality.
So this got us thinking, what would happen if the UN had to scale back operations in Afghanistan? The UN has nearly 4,000 staff in the country, made up of 3,300 Afghans and 600 international workers. And that includes 600 Afghan women and 200 women from other countries. The UN says its female staff members are essential to delivering life-saving work on the ground in Afghanistan.
A devastating blow against Afghan women, which will further undermine our collective ability of the entire community to support the population, and which is experiencing unprecedented humanitarian crisis.
Since the Taliban returned to power in 2021, things have steadily gotten worse for Afghan women, and in turn, for the whole country, because women are often on the front line of humanitarian efforts in Afghanistan. And the Taliban has consistently imposed restrictions on everything, from women's access to work, education, and public life, threatening the very fabric of Afghan society. After the U.S. military's chaotic withdrawal, the Taliban returned to power. During a wave of panic and mounting international pressure, they promised to uphold human rights, including those of women and girls, and freedom of the press.
Taliban fighters were sitting at the desk in the presidential palace. Afghanistan's army gave up without a fight.
Nearly a month later, the Taliban say women can only attend universities if the school entrances and classrooms are gender segregated. Then, in March 2022, the Taliban breaks their promise to reopen girls' secondary schools after months in limbo. Tens of thousands of teenagers are once again ordered to stay home.
Students filed home just an hour or so after having arrived. In private, Taliban members admit hardline elements within the group still find the idea of female education controversial, even though schools are already segregated.
In May 2022, the Taliban make it mandatory for women to fully cover themselves. Women are also banned from traveling between cities without an escort. In December, the Taliban carry out their first public execution in western Farah province. The following day, 27 Afghans, including women, are flogged in central Parwan province for allegedly committing crimes such as theft and breaking social behavior rules. Later that month, women are completely barred from attending university, no exceptions. And on the 24th of December, the Taliban say women cannot work for non-governmental organizations, which in many cases are the only opportunity for employment, and orders foreign and local agencies to suspend the hiring of women. Later in April, the Taliban issue an order to ban Afghan women employees of the United Nations staff from working throughout Afghanistan. And on April 11th, the UN instructs all of its staff in Afghanistan to stay home and not to report to UN offices as they launch a review of their operations in the country. Joining me now is Dr. Sam Nutt. She's the founder and president of War Child Canada, and she's joining me from California. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Lauren.
So what is this going to mean for the UN?
This is devastating news, not just for the UN, but for Afghan civilians as well. I mean, they are running a very large operation in Afghanistan, and the needs of Afghan civilians are only going to continue to escalate. We're looking at a very devastating humanitarian situation, which is threatening to deepen over the next couple of months. Even just if you look at, for example, the risk of famine, it's the highest risk that they have seen in almost a quarter century. And it's expected that this year alone, about 60% of Afghan civilians will require some form of international humanitarian assistance. So this news and the difficulties that the UN is facing is just, it's really incomprehensible for those of us who are operational right now. And it will only mean a worsening humanitarian catastrophe.
Right, so give us an idea of what the people who are working for the UN there, what they're doing.
They're responsible for a number of things. One of their main functions as well is the coordination of the humanitarian response. So all of the international organizations, including our own War Child, that are on the ground in Afghanistan, we look to the UN to provide guidance and direction to coordinate all of those activities. In addition, they have a major logistical infrastructure and operations. So they are the ones who are on the front line, for example, the World Food Program, of providing emergency food support. And again, I mean, we're talking about more than 28 million Afghan civilians this year who will need some kind of international humanitarian assistance. Half of them are children. If you strip the UN out of that equation, it's going to be very difficult to mount an effective humanitarian response. It's going to be difficult to get supplies when you need those supplies to run those kinds of distributions. They're also a main conduit for funding for organizations that are operational, where they receive the money and then disperse it according to who's operating where and where the needs are. So without that kind of action from the UN, capabilities from the UN, you're looking at not only a very chaotic humanitarian response, but an underfunded one, an under-resourced one, and increasingly an ineffective one, unfortunately.
So how does that make it more difficult for other aid groups who are working there?
It makes it difficult on every single level. Again, the UN has been on the front line of trying to negotiate concessions from the Taliban when it comes to women and girls, with everything from ensuring that women are part of the humanitarian response from a health perspective, from a food and nutrition perspective, from an educational perspective. They were really leading the charge on some of these negotiations. So to not have the UN operating at its fullest capacity, to not have those levers, it leaves us all adrift in what is an increasingly challenging humanitarian situation, security situation, economic situation, political situation. It means that you have a number of different organizations on the ground who are going to struggle to coordinate their activities, to resource them, and to do the jobs that we all know need to be done on an urgent basis.
So what does the UN need to be thinking about then going forward?
The UN has some very tough choices ahead. They will have to decide if they're going to continue their operations and accept the Taliban's edict that it must be only male staff who are delivering these operations, or if they're going to continue based on their own humanitarian principles to withdraw their staff, scale back their activities, if not cease some of those activities altogether. This is It is absolutely devastating. And the ones who will ultimately pay the price will be Afghan civilians. And again, the biggest price that will be paid from this will be the most vulnerable women and girls.
We'll be watching. Dr. Sam Nutt, thank you so much.
Thank you for covering this issue. It's really important and I appreciate it.